Welcome everyone to one of the very last sessions of the Oxford Conference. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope you've been enjoying it as much as I have. I've certainly been really inspired by so many of the speakers. We need to get going because we are going to finish promptly at 5 o'clock ahead of the closing plenary session. To very briefly introduce myself, my name is Chloë Dunnett. I'm the founder of a new urban farming social enterprise called Sitopia Farm. And we started early last year on a 2-acre site in inner London, growing vegetables and flowers using no-till techniques. So I've very much appreciated the really practical advice and learning from Jesse's podcast and now his book too. So to introduce our speaker for today's session, Jesse Frost, who is joining us from Kentucky in the USA, where I believe it's late morning and apparently about -9 degrees outside with a heavy dump of snow just arrived. Jesse, for those of you who don't know him already, is a farmer on a 1-acre market garden, along with his wife, Hannah Crabtree, who many of you might have heard yesterday at the excellent session on farmerhood, rearing animals, children, as well as crops. And he is also the author of the new book, The Living Soil Handbook, the host of the No-Till Market Garden podcast, and also co-creator of no-tillgrowers.com. These are all excellent resources. I urge you to check them out. We'll put some links in the chat if you haven't seen them already. As a new entrant farmer myself, I found these invaluable, really practical, really interesting to hear from growers all over the world about their particular context and experiences. I'm really enjoying at the moment working my way through his new book, The Living Soil Handbook. Particularly enjoyed the confession at the start, Jesse, where you said that actually you've never grown anything in your life. I'll leave it to you to explain a bit more about that. Just before I hand over, just to emphasize, I'm sure you're familiar with this by now, but if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A rather than the chat so we can make sure we pick them up. Jesse will be speaking for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have hopefully around 15 minutes for Q&A at the end before we finish at 5 for the closing plenary. So thank you very much, everyone, and over to you, Jesse.
All right, thank you. Chloe, that was a great introduction. I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen here. And let me know, can you see that, Chloe? Oh, wait, here we go. Can you see that, Chloe?
Yeah.
Everyone? Okay, great. Thank you to Chloe and thank you to the ORFC and everybody involved. This is, I mean, they've put on such an amazing conference here, kind of having to pivot there at the last minute. And I'm just really impressed with, I've always wanted to present at the ORFC. This is such a great conference. So I'm excited to talk about this particular subject right here, designing the right no-till system to fit your climate, soil, materials, and goals. I will largely refer to this as your context. I don't know how common that term is there, but it should be more common because it basically gathers all of those ideas into one thing. So designing the right no-till system for your context. This is by and large the subject of my book, right? I didn't want to write a book about how to farm like I farm. I wanted to write a book about this is how soil works, and here are ways that anyone can utilize those functions or maximize those functions, no matter where you are, no matter what your context is, no matter what your soil's like, your weather, your climate, etc. And so let's talk a little bit about my farm. So this is Rough Draft Farmstead. We just moved to this plot back about a year ago. We were on another plot. You'll see that in a minute. It is about an acre now. It actually has a plot here and a plot to the left there. So in a tunnel up here. Now this was taken back in June. You can see for scale, that's myself and my employee, Greg. We are, roughly 1 acre market garden. That's about 0.4 hectares. I'm going to try and do as many conversions as I can. So I'm not speaking in our, ridiculous measuring units here in the United States, but this is my wife, Hannah. She, as Chloe mentioned, she's my partner in the farm and she helps us run the business. And these are our livestock. If you want to find Kentucky, if you're wondering where it is, this is the best way to do it. We're known pretty well for our fried chicken and we're right here. So if you can imagine this is the United States, that's where we are. For those of you who are not in the United States or not familiar, I did not come up with this, but it is brilliant. this is a little bit better idea of our context, of the context that I'm working from here in Kentucky. So rainfall, we get on a dry year, maybe 100 centimeters and then in a wet year, you're talking 177 centimeters. So that's anywhere from like 40, 50 to 70 inches of rain. We've been closer to the 177 lately for the last few years than the 100. It seems like it's getting wetter, and we're also getting those rainfalls in very heavy loads, as opposed to kind of, over the course of the year. This past year, we had one day, often getting three inches in a day. So that would be like, or one day we had 4 inches in 4 hours. So that would have been like 10 centimeters in 4 hours. So we get really heavy rainfall. We also have very heavy soils on this new property, lots of clay, poor drainage. It does not drain well, which is surprising because we're on a bit of a slope, like I mentioned down here. Frost-free from roughly May until October. That's important just based on, that's a really long season for the most part. And that means that our weed pressure is a little bit higher, especially towards the latter part of the summer when they just keep their unrelenting. So we have to manage that. Cold winters, we have very, fairly cold winters. Like she mentioned, Chloe mentioned that we're down, today, -9 degrees Celsius. So that's, I think we were at roughly 9-10 degrees this morning. And it gets down to -17. So we get down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And then in the summertime, though, we're close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. It's pretty big swing. And we're what's considered semi-subtropical, loads of deciduous forests. So we have a lot of access to leaves and wood chips and those sorts of things. Horse farms abound here. So we have a lot of horse manure. And it's not a grain growing region. So we don't have a lot of access to things like straw or chaff or anything like that. So, and then, like I said, we're lightly sloped. So that's that encompasses our climate, our soil, materials, and goals, which I didn't talk about our market, but we're farmers market based, primarily farm. And that does affect how we run our no-till system. I want to point out a couple things that we've adapted before I kind of get onto the main part of this conversation, just based on that, like just giving you some examples of what taking that context and putting it to work looks like what that looks like on our farm. Because everything we do is based on our context. Every way that we manage our farm is based on how I'm, developing a no-till system in our particular context. So for instance, living pathways, we do, this isn't something that may work everywhere, but it works really well in our context because it sheds that rainfall really well. It either absorbs it or allows it to just run off without taking the soil or compost with us. Now that does happen sometimes, especially in the early year when we were developing our living pathways. But for the most part, that's something that developed out of our context. Also, we use a lot of cover crops. You can see them here on the right. You can see the mulch and the pathways there. But that works better than like if we put wood chips here, they would often in those heavy rainfalls would just wash out depending on where on our farm they are. So oftentimes we're using things like living pathways, or in this case, like a living mulch that dies, and we use that as the pathway mulch. But we also do a lot of intercropping. This is actually one of the pictures from our old farm that you'll see. We used 30-inch beds, but this is kind of intercropping. This is like practical intercropping. We try and incorporate as much biodiversity as makes sense for a production market garden. So this is a little bit easier. Oftentimes we can plant both sides at the same time. We can harvest from both sides at the same time. You can see that with the spinach. Sometimes that doesn't always work out, but it did. In this case, it wouldn't be the biggest deal in the world for us to have to just harvest this one side. So that's, another thing is like we try and incorporate as much habitat and biodiversity as we can. So this is, like I said, a new farm. So we don't have the perennials yet established, but we do have things like we use a lot of annuals like tithonia and sunflowers. And we, incorporate birdhouses and those sorts of things, lots of herbs to encourage beneficials and those sorts of things. And then move this out of the way, the cover crops. This is another big thing that we do. So we raise our beds. You can see they're raised. These are actually turned, can't really see, and you'll see it from above in a minute, but they're actually turned to the side. So they drain water really well. They're raised up. They're 4 feet wide. This is because there are growing space here to maximize it. we found that when we did the math, 4-foot wide beds were, was a better use of space than 30-inch wide beds. So that's contextual, right? If we had more space, maybe we'd be okay with the 30-inch beds, but it's also fewer pathways. So it's a little bit less management there. And all that developed, just out of our context. This all developed out of what we, where our farm is, the kind of climate, the kind of rainfall that we get, the kind of soil. So I want to kind of discuss that. But first, we have to talk about this term, no-till, because maybe people have an idea of what that is. But one of the things with no-till is you don't want to be too dogmatic about it. So I want to let's see if I can move this out of the way. Okay. There we go. So designing the right no-till system comes down to deciding what no-till actually means. But in order to do that, this is not actually the right question, right? It's not what is no-till, because that says no-till is or isn't a specific thing. The right question to ask is, what is tillage, right? So maybe take a second and just think about that term for yourself and like what you think, like what comes to mind when you hear that term tillage. For me, you may think of like large scale farms, you may think of just the tiller or something like that. Oftentimes, no matter what you think of it, it probably looks a little bit like that, right? So this is probably involved somewhere in that definition. This idea of like hard pan soil or of erosion or something like that. But when you look at it in the dictionary, it comes up something like this. So to prepare the soil for growing crops. And that makes sense to an extent. It's definitions, dictionaries often trail behind, popular culture. And this is one of those instances, because to prepare the soil for growing crops, it's not totally incorrect. I mean, that is the intention of tillage. And for thousands of years, really, that's kind of all it was. This is actually modern day Indonesia. I didn't take this photograph. I got some of these from Pexels, is a website that has really great photographers that you can donate to who do really amazing work. But they, this has obviously like a road and there's like a tower up there on the top, but this is probably not unlike what, semi-subtropical or subtropical or even tropical farming looked like, has looked like for thousands of years. And indigenous people were farming on very small scale. So, very diversely. There's, that maybe is like potatoes and then rices and all these different things going on, all these tree fruit, probably tree crops, palm, all sorts of stuff. And, that diversity that made sense, right? That was to them the idea of tillage was just preparing the soil for growing crops. That makes sense because there was probably some soil movement in here, but look at how diverse and bountiful that is. But then slowly over time, you have these, let me see if I can move this thing again. Maybe I can just minimize it. Sorry, I'm talking to myself here. You had bone and wood and stone plows. This is how a lot of people were doing this sort of tillage. These were slowly replaced by iron. Then iron plows were replaced by the stronger, lighter steel. Diverse plantings were replaced by monocultures. Over time, chemicals replaced things like fire, hand tools, manure, and biodiversity as the primary way to manage fertility, weeds, pests, and diseases. A lot of Swidden agriculture and those sorts of things where you're burning crop residue or trees or whatever area you're doing that for a lot of different reasons. And one of them was, managing weeds, but also managing diseases and those sorts of things. And so as this became more the primary thing, and then also animal power was slowly replaced by tractor power. And suddenly what it meant to prepare the ground for growing crops changed because it was so, you could do it on such a scale, and you could do it from row to row, from road to road rather. And, tillage sort of took on all the negative effects of what it meant to prepare the soil for growing crops. And so, and that's, things like erosion and pollution and habitat destruction and erosion, wind erosion, water erosion, pollution, nitrates and phosphates leaking into rivers and waters, and habitat destruction, not just macro stuff like for deer and quail and all the different things that live in pastures, but also for microbial habitats and things like earthworms and all the things that we need for soil to be really healthy. And and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there've been a lot of negative effects. The Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s was largely ineffective over tillage, where millions of acres of soil that had been managed by Native Americans and the buffalo for thousands of years in the plains was plowed up, and that eventually, once that hit a drought, the lack of sustainability or sufficiency of that became very evident, and that the soil started to blow away, and it still does that today. We're still having issues of windstorms of dust storms in the United States and in drier areas. And in many ways, what we commonly think of as tillage makes the soil increasingly less prepared to grow much of anything. Right? It's not feeding the soil. It's releasing a lot of carbon dioxide and carbon storage. It's preferring, bacterial dominant microorganisms, which we need some of them, but it's making those proliferate and killing off some of the fungal and less adapt the ones that adapt less to disturbance. And so we need a more accurate, updated definition of tillage, in my opinion. And we need one for the dictionary to catch up. And so this is the one that I propose: that tillage is anything that causes long-term harm to the soil. Now, that can be, it doesn't have to just be tillers and discs and plows and spaders, right? Because a lot of things can cause this. A lot of things can cause erosion and pollution and habitat destruction. I mean, you could do it with a spoon if you were so ambitious, but erosion in particular, well, let's think of some things that are often used in agriculture that may not be a tiller. Plastic, right? You put plastic against the soil at the end of the season, you pull it up, and with that plastic comes what? Soil, a lot of soil in many cases. And that's a form of erosion. Or pollution. I mean, that ends up in the landfills, right? And then ends up in microplastics, and that ends up in your soil, and then they're finding that in human placentas now. So, those are things to think about. Chemicals do the same thing. Chemicals reduce even chemical fertilizers reduce the efficacy of plants to create soil organic matter and slow that down. And obviously create pollution, habitat destruction as well. So it doesn't have to just be something like a tiller or a rotavator, I think, as you often refer to them out there. So if tillage is anything that causes long-term harm to the soil, the question then becomes, what is no-till? And no-till is not just avoiding things that harm the soil. No-till is about actively increasing and promoting long-term soil health. So you can avoid tillage all the time, but that's when you kind of get into this dogmatic area of, is just not tilling the soil actually better for your soil? So we need, in order to really understand how this is going to work and how to adapt it to your context, for me, I think it's important to kind of start with the basic principles. And these are basic principles that I sort of, that I did not come up with, to be clear. These are the conservation agriculture principles, but these helped me to outline the book. It's like the outline of the book is based on these 3 principles, or actually 4 principles. So what are they? The first one is keeping the soil covered as much as possible. Now, that can be various different mulches, but it can also include plants like cover crops. This is garlic that is mulched with hay. We have a rotation of plots that is, and maybe I'll be able to show you that in a minute, but we have a high rotation plot that is mostly in like a deep compost, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But then we have a slow rotation plot that is managed with hay and cover crops. And so that includes crops like garlic and those sorts of things. But we keep the soil covered as much as possible to reduce erosion, to increase water holding capacity, to increase soil organic matter, habitat for microbes, habitat for fungi, etc. Nutrients as well. Hay is really high in nutrients. Keep the soil planted as much as possible. Now, this is something that I wish I had enough time today to go into photosynthesis, because that is the primary driver of energy in the world. We all depend very heavily on photosynthesis. So we keep all of our beds planted at all times, including the pathways, which are likewise planted to clovers and native grasses. And I don't have a lot of people want to know what my living pathway formula is, and I don't really have one because nature kind of just ultimately is the main decider. We try and put as many clovers in there as possible, but we don't always get a say in that. It just depends on how we mow them, how we manage them, but also like the temperature, the weather, the time of year, and those things. So we keep it planted as much as possible, and that just ensures that the soil is always being fed, right? We tend to think of mulches as something that feeds the soil, and it does to an extent, but it's really just a reuse of energy. Like this is carbon. Carbon is stored sunlight energy through photosynthesis, and then the soil microbes start to use that and kind of reuse it. But you are losing carbon dioxide a lot this way. This way, you are storing you're inputting energy into the soil through photosynthesis. So like I said, I wish I could go more into photosynthesis, but I do that a lot in my book if you're interested. Disturb the soil as little as possible. This one's probably the one that requires the most fleshing out. And the reason is we tend to think of disturbance as a bad thing. Disturbance and tillage are different, and they can't be conflated, because it is important as our role in growing food to know that disturbance can be really beneficial to soil. And Chloë had mentioned earlier that I opened the book talking about making a confession that I've never actually grown anything in my life. And that's true. I make the conditions right for food to grow. I don't grow anything. The microbes grow the food, the soil, the sunlight, the water, the carbon dioxide. Those are the things that the nutrients, those are the things that grow food. I make the conditions right for growing food. And sometimes that requires a small amount of disturbance, calculated disturbance. So, we think of like, this is a blank slate. This is a deep compost mulch system. But even if this was just soil, one of the abilities we have, like me pulling the soil aside and putting a plant in, is not negative to the soil. I'm putting a photosynthesizing plant into the soil. That is a really special ability that humans have, that we can steward immediate photosynthesis for the soil. Which, nature can, to a certain extent, do that in certain situations, but a lot of times they're relying on seeds. Seeds take several days to germinate in the right conditions. So you could end up with a fallow field for a really long time if you're just relying on nature to do it. In this case, we're doing that work, and we're doing it really quickly and keeping the soil planted at all times. So we could take out that entire crop of whatever was before it, and immediately within hours have another photosynthesizing plant put right back in its place. So we use a lot of transplants on our farm. And, like I said, no-till does not equal no disturbance ever. This is another example of putting a photosynthesizing plant immediately into the soil. In this case, we are drilling pretty deep into the soil and transplanting our main season tomatoes. And then afterward, we'll actually follow up. This had beets on it and green onions and lettuce interplanted. So these 4-foot beds were all filled out with other plants. But you can see that this went from a blank slate to a jungle really quickly. And this is another controversial one. This is the broad fork. And some people will say, well, that's, it's harming the soil. It's doing some disturbance. This is, if you can see how compacted it is, my soil is in a spot. If I didn't do this, I would be requiring really shallow rooted plants to do that work. And it would take them many years of poor performance to really get into that soil. And so I think a year or 2 or 3, if necessary, especially in heavy soils, of doing some broad forking is a good idea. It's a great way to approach breaking up compaction, and it's a tool that ultimately makes itself obsolete. So in this case, is it causing long-term harm to the soil, or is it promoting soil health? Is it something that's promoting soil health? So anytime you're thinking of taking on a new tool or taking on a new practice technique, think about that. Just think about it from those contexts. Like, don't let the dogma of, this is tillage and this is not tillage affect how you're addressing your specific situation. Because it's disturbance, there's all sorts of disturbance here, right? But look at how bountiful this is. There's all sorts of disturbance here too. Like, I had to turn these beds that we raise all of our beds, and we turn them downhill so they'll shed water. And in fact, these are now turned downhill as well. And these are actually turned to the right. And so that is part of it, is some amount of disturbance can actually be really beneficial to your overall soil health. And these are turned downhill so that they'll shed that water, because in our scenario, we're getting that 177 centimeters of water can be really, it can drown our crops. And we had a lot of that. This is the first year that I've ever had so much trouble with drainage. And we had a lot of trouble right here in this area. with crops just not performing because of poor drainage. So something we had to navigate and grow as diversely as possible with a diversity of life promoting inputs. So as many crops as you can, as makes sense in your context, and that would be like your markets and the kind of crops that you want to grow, but also with a bunch of life promoting inputs that would be like compost teas, vermicast, humic acid and other life promoting materials. And this is the four, right? And this is the most important part of them. Do it as much as possible. Like, don't get hung up on the dogma, because that is going to, your soil is not going to be the same as, whoever you see on Instagram or YouTube or wherever. It's not necessarily the same. It may work the same, but it may not. And so you really just, if you're more conscious of that and you're really thinking about what your soil needs, then you're going to be able to manage it better. Like, for instance, this is my new farm that I've been showing you. This is my old farm. These farms are about 15 minutes apart from each other, and they could not be more different. This farm was drained really well. Soil was really nice, kind of this really nice silty loam, but it also had a lot of rocks. This soil is a lot of clay, and it doesn't have a lot of rocks, and it doesn't drain at all. And this one was on top of a hill, had a lot of wind to manage. This one actually has, and is very exposed. This one doesn't have a lot of wind issues, and it has these nice trees over here, so that provides a little bit of sun in the early morning for some of the more sensitive crops that we grow in the middle of the summer. So I didn't have that option over here. This was just exposed all day long, every day, and there are benefits, and those are just things that I have to work my system around. So let's talk about. I'm going to try and let's see. I don't want to take up too much time. Okay, so determining your context. This is hard, and it takes some time. And maybe you've been farming your same plot for 5 years and you're like looking at these no-till techniques and you're like, okay, well, I kind of understand my context, but let's just go through it. And then some of you will be doing it for free for the first time rather. So we talk about soil condition. So that would be your soil organic matter and your chemistry. These are often measured from a soil test. And I don't do a lot with chemistry beyond, if there's some deficiency or there's some grave thing that's really out of whack, then I think about that. But things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, I address with compost. Some things like molybdenum, that's one that's often deficient depending on where you are. So if you have like a severe deficiency, maybe you address the chemistry a little bit more. pH, if it's really, really out of whack, those are things that you can, consult with an agronomist. Soil organic matter is important in situations where your soil doesn't drain very well. Especially in those situations, if you have decent soil, if you have a decent base, then you can get away with a lower soil organic matter. But if you're talking about sand, you may want to increase your soil organic matter before you get started with your beds. Compaction. So this is probably the one that does not get harped on enough by anyone. This is one of the main limiting factors in a lot of the soils that we're all working on, because they've been driven over by big machinery or they've been plowed up thousands and thousands of times or whatever it is, maybe not thousands, but many, many times. Much heavy machinery, heavy rainfall, all of those things. Compaction is an enormously limiting factor, and plants can break it up like cover crops and those sorts of things. But even in the perfect conditions, it can take many, many years. In drainage, these are things that we measure. You measure with a penetrometer. Compaction. Drainage, you measure by digging a hole, filling it with water, and seeing how long it takes to drain. If it takes, I forget, there's like a lot of videos on how to do that, but if it takes like over 12 or hours or 24 hours to really drain that hole, that means you need to address your drainage. And that's probably beyond the scope of our talk here, but there's a lot of ways to address drainage. And one of them is just using good practices like cover crops. Soil type, if you're heavy clay, you want to address that differently than if you're heavy sand. Rainfall, and not just the amount, but how it comes. I mentioned that we get really heavy rainfalls in the beginning of this talk. That matters a lot. Like if we got 70 inches, but it all kind of came smoothly over the year and it was just kind of raining, that would be different than how we get it, which is we'll go 2 weeks without rain and then we'll get 4 inches. Or we'll go a week where we get, 3 inches and then 3 inches and then 3 inches and then nothing for 3 weeks. And then some, like it comes in very heavy quantities oftentimes for us. So we have to, so things like I mentioned earlier, wood chips are really hard for us because with those heavy rainfalls, the wood chips float and they will just float right over top of the bed or out of the pathways. So in the field, we can't use things like wood chips as much. Available materials like compost mulches neighbors with tractors. I'm not joking about that one. That one's really important. That if you may determine how you want to set up your beds. If you don't have a lot of people around that can help you, or maybe you utilize things like I've utilized our neighbor's stuff for various, moving various materials because we don't own a large tractor. So that's been super helpful, and we trade work for that. Markets and crops, those are important. If you're growing longer season crops, it's going to be your context is going to be a little bit different. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, just because I want to make sure to get to some of the other stuff in this talk. Climate, your heat, maybe you don't want to use a dark compost if you're in a really hot area. If it's really windy, maybe you want to think about how you're able to put up covered material or covered structures like greenhouses and those things. Growing season duration, if you have a really long season, you may want to think about deeper mulches, because deeper mulches will prevent weeds and you'll have to refresh those really regularly. So maybe you want to change up the type of mulch that you're using in the middle of the season. So maybe you'd want to use a lighter color mulch in the middle of the season and a darker colored mulch in the like compost in the spring and fall. Goals, aesthetics, low maintenance, scale, organic, non-organic, certification, that is. Those are all determine a little bit about what your context is. If you're trying to be organic, you have to find compost that, if you want to use this like a no dig system and you want to be organic, you do have to abide by the organic regulations around compost. So, and local restrictions and regulations. And I can't obviously get too much into those. Those will depend on your situation. But if if somebody is worried about what you're planting or how you're planting it or how your field looks, that will obviously determine your context. And slope is another one I wish I could get into. This is actually Sage Hill Ranch Gardens out in California. And this is our buddy, Spencer Rudolph. And they terraced this, like I showed you, in the Indonesia photo. They terraced this, and that's part of their context, right? They have to manage their system based on what they have here. And there's videos with Spencer, and there's also, if you're dealing with a big hillside like this, there's videos with Spencer on a No-Till Growers YouTube, and also did an interview with him. And another one is Small Axe Farm, Vermont. You can look up those, and they talk a little bit about managing slope. No dig, deep compost mulch system. Let's just talk about some of these systems real quick, and you can decide if they are right for you. Okay, good. We've got about 15 minutes. So the no dig deep compost mulch system, this is the one that a lot of you are going to be most familiar with. This is one that's popularized by people like Charles Dowding. He's done a great work on this. It is oftentimes a cardboard underneath on top of pasture or on top of cleared soil, and a layer of compost. So maybe that's 10 centimeters or more, probably, up to 20 centimeters or whatever, depending on how much compost you have access to. But then that's layered on top, and it acts as both a mulch. So it retains moisture and all the things that mulches do, suppresses weeds, but it also as a growing medium. So, and also wood chips, are often associated with the deep compost mulch system or the no dig system. I like wood chips a lot of times undercover, because that rain issue is not going to be as big of a deal. You'll see in a second that we have wood chips in other areas, but mostly undercover. And so let's talk about where it works well. Areas with low to moderate rainfall, right? It retains moisture really well. And it can handle a decent amount of rainfall. A lot of rain just pours straight through the compost. Cold to mild regions, I like this in the wintertime because it's warmer than my native soil. Just that dark color. Areas with access to good compost, like if you have really great compost, it's worth looking to where you can utilize this system. Not everybody has access to good compost, so that's part of the negatives. Smaller scales, if you are looking at scales where you're doing, if you want to do 6 acres like this, it's a little bit tougher. You got to have a lot of compost. You have to have a lot of material for that. And you have to have a good way to spread it efficiently. Medium to heavy soils, lighter soils, it's a little bit more complicated, like, sandy soils, because you're putting compost that can be kind of mildly hydrophobic. So that means it just sheds water really quickly on top of soil that's itself kind of hydrophobic. So that's something you'd have to manage maybe a little bit differently. That there's exceptions to every single rule I'm going to say today. So you may know somebody that does it well on sand, and that could be partly because their sand has developed good organic matter, could be partly because they have really good access to compost that holds moisture really well. And it could just be the way that their soil, like they get enough rain that it doesn't matter. So farms producing high profit crops, right? Compost can be expensive. So you need the crops that come out of the compost to be high value and to cover those costs, because you do have to match. It does have to make sense on paper, profitability wise. Covered areas, like I showed you, like the high tunnels, the caterpillar tunnels, those are good places for this. Here's some places it may not. Uncovered with regularly heavy rainfalls, like that's why we don't use a lot of compost in our field, or when we do, we actually put the living pathways and not the wood chips. Very hot regions, maybe, could be an issue where you have this really dark compost. So putting things like, we grow a lot of summer lettuce. It's really tough sometimes to get summer lettuce to produce well without shade cloth and exterior things to keep the soil from being too hot to just burn up those roots. Like they're not happy above 75 degrees, but the compost can get very hot. Regions with poor little compost, if you don't have, like, a lot of times people are like, I'd love to do that, but I live in the middle, America's very spread out. So oftentimes people in rural areas don't have access to compost. Maybe they can find some people who do some horse manure or something that they can use, but a lot of times it can be tough and it can be expensive. Larger scale, and also poor compost, just not very good compost, or compost that maybe is like municipal compost, or compost that is maybe tainted with chemicals, or there's lots of different things that can make compost poor. Larger scales, right? Like we talked about, it's hard to spread that much compost. Farms where the crops are low profit, again, like you're not going to want to put corn and soybeans or something like that, watermelons, maybe even in like, fields of pumpkins or something, where you're, with expensive compost, unless you can get it for cheap or free. Then maybe it's something you'd want to think differently about. Fast draining soils too, especially around waterways. Like we don't talk enough about the potential of pollution from things like compost. But phosphorus, nitrogen, just depends on the quality of compost. It depends on your soil. It depends on how much rain you get, and it depends on how close it is to waterways and your underground, where your water table is. Cover crops, I want to talk. Okay, so that's one system, is the no dig system. Cover crops, I do want to talk about this because, in my opinion, cover crops are kind of the best thing you can do for your soil. That's from experience, and it's just from the literature. This is this sort of stuff. The mulch is certainly feeding the soil. Lots of saprotrophic organisms are eating up all that woody material in various organisms, and they're releasing those nutrients so the plants have access to them. This is pumping energy. Cover crops are pumping energy into your soil for the microbes that live there. They're keeping those microbes alive, the microbes that actually feed your plants, the microbes that live off your plant roots. They're keeping those microbes alive. They're feeding them. They're building soil organic matter. They're just doing an enormous amount for the soil. So they're providing food. So food in the form of glucose through photosynthesis. They're providing a mulch oftentimes. So this one's actually chopped up with a flail mower, but you can see where we had a rye here, and then we planted these tomatoes, and then that mulch sort of remains. There's so many different variations and combinations for many different things. From there's not cereal rye or vetch in this picture, but the vetch is a really good one for fixing nitrogen, like mung beans, any legume. Cereal rye for knocking back weeds, for the allelopathic effects of their root exudates. Sesbania is really good in drought conditions. Buckwheat's really good for flowers, for pollinators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's just a bazillion different combinations that can be really beneficial to your soil. And so this is just kind of the general rundown. They enhance and fix nutrients. They improve gas exchange. So the ability for the soil to respire carbon dioxide, but also to bring nitrogen around the roots that nitrogen fixing organisms can fix for the plants. In any sort of off gases, any sort of gases need to be able to leave the soil. And also oxygen is a really important factor. Build soil organic matter through the roots. The roots, it's not about the above ground biomass. It is very much about the below ground biomass, about the root systems. So this is rye and a bunch of other stuff, rye and wheat, and there's actually some crimson clover and stuff in here as well. They improve water holding capacity, the ability for the soil to hold water. And that's partially because of the soil organic matter. And just a million other things. It's just great. So, where you can use cover crops, they're excellent. And where can you use cover crops? Areas with moderate to high rainfall. They're good for that because they're keeping the soil in place and they're thriving on that moisture. They work in pretty much all soil types. You'll have to, navigate sandy soil a little bit differently, or maybe drought areas a little bit differently. Medium to large scales, oftentimes you don't see it on small scales because the cover crops can be, take up space for a really long time. Most crop types, it works with most crop types, though direct seeding is a little bit more complicated. You have to choose your cover crops really wisely. Winter kill cover crops are a lot better for that because then you can just rake them away in the spring. Somebody who's done really good work with cover crops on a medium to large, on a medium scale, small scale, is Daniel Mays of Frith Farm. His book, The No-Till Organic Vegetable Farm, I think is what it's called, but Daniel Mays of Frith Farm, his book is really excellent, and talks a lot about that. And most climates have compatible cover crop options. Even, like I said, dry, that Suspania is a really good one for drought areas, drought prone areas. Great for expanding new areas with low capital investment too. So if you're looking for a mulch, you don't have a lot of money to spend on it, but you have a plow and you can plow up an area and put a cover crop down, then you can have both a new area and a really well-fed area and a mulched area very quickly. Where it may not work as well is regions with very low rainfall, because then you're going to have to manage the water yourself. Regions, because they'll need moisture just like anything else. Regions with very short seasons. So if you're looking at 100 growing days and you want to use cover crops, it's going to be a little bit more complicated, because when are you going to get those cover crops in, and how are you going to terminate them, and how are you going to have the time to do that without using up all of your space? In very small scales, like I mentioned, they do take up space, and they take up space oftentimes for several months, depending on which cover crops you use. Although I will say that things like buckwheat are 20 days, 21 days to flower. So if you just have one crop in the middle of the season, you don't have a spot for throwing in some buckwheat. I've seen some things recently that may suppress weeds, but it's also just really good for pollinators, gathering microbes, and I think good for phosphorus accumulation as well. Farms with a lot of direct seeded cover crops, direct seeded crops, like I mentioned, is really tough. Let me see how we're doing on time. This is, like I mentioned, I do some wood chips in the pathways. This is no or low mulch no-till. So the idea here is you're still using a lot of cover crops, or a lot of compost rather, but you're working in to the top 1-2 inches. And over time, you're kind of creating your own mulch. And what that does is it incorporates a lot of those the clay particles and the things that retain moisture into the compost. So you get kind of a mulch that's really good for like direct seeded crops and that sort of stuff. So yeah, like I said, heavy applications of good compost, of really high quality compost, are lightly worked into the top few inches of soil. And I would consider those a nutritional compost for anybody that's read my book. I talk about the 4 types of compost, but again, beyond the scope of this particular talk. And where those work well is covered areas, right, where you're not going to deal as much with erosion. Practically any soil type can be done with a low or no mulch, no-till. It's the where mulches are not as available, where it's expensive or hard to find mulches that are, or maybe you're in the beginning stages and you don't have the capital for a lot of compost. That's a good place to start. Maybe baby greens and other direct seeded crops really thrive in this scenario. So they like that high fertility, but also those little clay particles and et cetera that get mixed in there that help retain the moisture that they need for germination. Regions with heavy rainfall, if you're planting outside, it can slow down. Having kind of bare soil like that can slow down planting times. It can involve mud. It may, especially before it's really filled out with compost, can cause erosion, backsplash on plants from the rain. Areas with heavy weed pressure, that can be an issue. You not having a mulch can be an issue, but and wind-prone areas where that soil may blow away. And I apologize for talking so fast. I just wanted to make it through as much of this as possible. The last thing I'm just going to say is like the lightly colored mulches. This is another version, straw or hay mulch that's applied. If you want me to talk about this, ask Chloë, because I want to make sure to get enough questions in for Q&A, because we have to stop promptly at 5. So let's jump to questions. And if you want me to talk a little bit about those lighter colored mulches, which you generally use in like a hotter environment, or in a situation where you want to cool the soil, we can do that. So maybe if you want to jump in, Chloë, and if there are questions that people have.
Great, thank you so much, Jessie. That was excellent, really informative and beautiful photos. We've got lots of questions, so I'll try and get through as many as possible. There are a few around living paths. You mentioned you had those in between the beds, and questions particularly around how that might compare with wood chip. Some people concerned that wood chip gave them slugs, and just wondering how it compared in terms of pests and generally feeding the soil and maintenance, and linked to that in terms of wood chip general use. Do you think particular woods are good or bad?
Oh, well, one thing I'll point people to is Ben Raskin just wrote a really good book on wood chips. Wood chips, okay, so they're really high in nutrients. They're really great for your soil. They tend to be habitat for things like saprotrophic fungi and things that are good at breaking down that lignin material. So it is good. There's a lot of benefits to it soil wise. Slugs can be an issue. I think that we don't have this kind of slugs that a lot of people have, and especially in the UK and out in California, slugs that actually damage crops. We have slugs that kind of get into crops and kind of are annoying, but they're not in great numbers. So my experience with slugs is that the places that we've put wood chips down, they don't seem to invite too much more slugs than anything else. That said, it may be different in your area and your climate. As you increase your general diversity, those sorts of things will balance out. It may take a little while, but you may see some extra slug pressure at first. The living pathways, we've not seen any slug pressure at all develop from that. That isn't necessarily going to be true everywhere. It may just depend on your slug species, but I have not seen any issues with that. And maybe that's because we're walking on them a lot, we're harvesting on them a lot, we're mowing them pretty regularly throughout the growing season. So we haven't seen any increased pressure from that yet. And it may develop given the year, maybe based on the species that grow there. So my inclination right now is to say that those are not big issues for us, but it may be worth just testing these on small scale and seeing if you see any ill effects in your region. Yeah.
Okay, great. And in terms of wood chip, the particular wood that you think is good or not so good for use?
A diversity of wood chips is ideal. There's a lot of people that say don't use all cedar, don't use all walnut, or I think if you can get a mix, it's ideal. A lot of times we don't get a choice. Like we get whatever wood chips our wood chipper brings. So if you have a choice, maybe just try and get a mix. Preferably a lot of people like ramial wood chips. So that's like the wood chips from the newest growth. And that's great if you can get those. I know there are people that actually produce that in Quebec. There's at least one person in Quebec that produces from willow trees. They produce ramial wood chips. Those are great. I mean, that's like the highest nutrient that you can get. But what depends on what you have access to. If you feel like it is all one species and it is something like cedar that avoids decomposition, or like walnut that doesn't that may have some sort of negative chemicals in it that may reduce plant growth. I don't think there's a lot to that, but I think being and I know that Ben actually covers that in his book, and I can't remember what he says now, but generally speaking, it's not an issue.
Yeah, great book. Recommend that for everyone. Ben Raskin, Wood Chip Handbook. Thanks, Jessie.
Yeah, it's great.
There are a couple of questions around using compost as a mulch and for raised beds.
Mm-hmm.
Ash and Cape Trill Farm highlighted there's been quite a lot of chat about this in the UK in the last few years, and some concerns raised about that this can potentially lead to soil obesity through effectively overfeeding the soil and then leaching of nutrients and leading to pollution, and whether you had any thoughts on that. And related, Georgina was considering using no dig, but had some concerns about whether there'd be issues bringing in compost from elsewhere in the country and disrupting their own delicate ecosystem. So any thoughts on that?
Well, maybe to answer the first one or the second one first, that second part about disrupting ecosystems, if the compost exists because there's so much waste, right? There's so much food waste, there's so much wood chip waste, there's all these carbonaceous materials that just get thrown out. I think we do have some amount of obligation to be putting those back into the soil. The question, and so, as long as those exist, then maybe it's, I think it's worth it for us to be endorsing and supporting things that are taking those waste streams and putting them to use and putting them back into the soil. So I would say generally right now, I wouldn't dwell too much on that. The first part of the question is a big one. I've asked a lot of agronomists. I've spent a lot of time thinking and working on this and researching it. Generally, phosphorus is something that physically phosphorus is a chemical that we see, not a chemical, it's a nutrient that we see polluting lakes, and that's where you get the algae blooms and those sorts of things. And that's one that is actually not, from the agronomists that I've spoken to, going to be as big of an issue as nitrates. The phosphorus really is attached to the particles, and it's going to be, if it physically washes off your property, like if your compost is washing into the river, that's when you're going to see those issues be compounded. So yeah, there is a potential for pollution there. With nitrates much more mobile. If you're using a really high nitrogen compost, you need to be applying that very lightly. A lot of the compost that we're using as a compost mulch are not as high nitrogen. They tend to be much more carbonaceous and much more balanced. And if you're regularly planting into those, my understanding just from the many agronomists I've asked this question to is that, you're utilizing that nitrogen, utilizing the excess nutrients in there. Phosphorus buildup is a potential, and that can limit mycorrhizal fungi. So you just got to monitor that. But there does come a point when you've been utilizing this system for long enough that that you don't have to be applying more compost. You need to be, if you're seeing issues, you can use cover crops to extract excess nutrients, and then you pull those cover crops off, and that rebalances your soil, and it also creates better soil organic matter. So don't be afraid to hybridize these systems, or just be monitoring these systems. If you're starting to see negative effects from the compost you're using, maybe back off, maybe rake it onto the pathways. It has to be a little bit more fluid, because when we're talking about compost, it is a million different things. So you just have to be responsible and monitor your soil tests and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Right, thank you. You mentioned cover crops. There are a few questions around that as well, particularly around how you transition and flip the beds from cover crops to main crops, and how you ensure there's not too much competition from the remnants of the cover crop, particularly when you're planting at the early stages, getting a new one established.
Yeah, strategically, that's like the big thing, is that you have to make sure to choose your cover crop wisely. A lot of people look and they say, okay, so rye is a really good winter cover crop, I'm going to use that one. But you have to know how you're going to terminate it and how long it's going to take to get to the termination point, which there's many different ways to terminate cover crops. Some can just be mowed down. And especially at the right stages. Some can be tarped. A lot of times we can use plastic tarps. Plastic has a lot of issues, but in this particular instance, you could flatten your cover crop down. You throw a plastic tarp over it for a few weeks in a warmer part of the season. That sort of kills it. And then you pull that back, and then you can plant into that. Now, in terms of like competition with roots, it's a little bit more complicated. It depends on what you're planting. Like direct seeded crops, or like I mentioned in the talk, are going to have a harder time in that scenario. Whereas if you're transplanting, I use an auger bit like you saw with the tomatoes, and I just drill in and I put in a plant. Yeah, I have smaller auger bits on a drill. So they're maybe like, I don't know what it would be in centimeter, like a couple inches wide. So I would drill that in, and then I would pop the plant right into that, and we'll just drill down the line. We'll pop our plants in, and we'll go from there. A lot of times the soil's loose enough after it's broken down for a little while that you can just pull it aside and pop a plant in. It just depends on the cover crop and what your goals are. And each cover crop is going to be different for how you terminate it. So I do dedicate a lot of that in the book. There's like a whole cover crop termination guide in the book. So if anybody has questions about that. Yeah.
Thank you. The question around polyculture from Alice, I'll read it out. Alice says she's beginning to farm in a more polyculture style, both at Satopia Farm with me and at the Landry Farms for Growing Communities in Dagenham in London, due to trying to keep the ground filled and beginning to understand the beneficial relationships between different plant families of microbes. It does mean no longer sticking to strict rotations, so it can become a bit messy looking and things finish at different points, but overall she thinks it's okay. And have you found this? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to address that question because there's so many different ways to do a polyculture, but we want as much diversity in our soil as possible. In a production context, it's really important for that to be practical. So like I showed, our main form of interplanting is actually really like sharing a bed. It's two beds kind of shoved into one, so that there's some intermingling between the plants, but we're not making it so complex that we have to, that our organic certifier is looking at it like no idea what to do with that, because crop rotation is important for organic certification. But yeah, generally we're trying to keep it practical for ourselves, and that helps with avoid that chaos that can come with it. It also allows us to do more crop rotation by keeping it practical. But crop rotation is important in situations where you have unhealthy soil. And if you're seeing a lot of disease, you definitely want to move your crops out of those areas. Like if you need to plant brassicas after brassicas, but you're seeing some disease, or you're seeing some aphid issue or something, you definitely want to think about how you're going to rotate those out. So leaving room for some amount of rotation, I think, is a good idea, just to keep that flexibility. But at the same time, I don't think rotation all the time is absolutely necessary. There's something to be said for gathering the nutrients and microbes that a brassica or whatever a legume wants, and then putting that similar crop or same crop in the same family back in that bed, because that, it's already set up for it to succeed to an extent. So yeah, I mean, I think that you kind of have to play around with it a little bit, and try and keep it as practical as possible, just for your own sanity. But yeah, and own productivity. Yeah.
Great, thank you. One question full of puns here from Max. What specifically about your farm here? Hopefully we've got a couple of minutes left. What are your routes to market, and do you manage to cover crop your costs?
We do, our market is a farmer's market. We do, we do a little bit of restaurant sale, retail. We're also opening a farm store. I love direct to consumer. We've done the CSA sort of box scheme for several years. We've actually backed off of that, because it's something that really thrives when you can dedicate all your energy to it. But I kind of come from a retail background. I talked yesterday in my talk about coming from my wine retail background. I really like that. I like that sales part, engaging with the customer. So we have a lot of great regular customers at the farmers market. So that's been our kind of main thing. And yeah, we, cost wise, like I think there's almost nothing more important to learning how to farm than learning how to manage the farm business. And so we're always working on that. That's something that, you never really are, for us, like we're not to the peak of where we can be in our business, especially because we just moved and we're putting a lot of capital investment back into the farm, a new property. But yeah, I mean, focusing on the business side of things is critical, and just judging your profitability for each cropping. Like I like growing beets, and when I put it to pen and paper, it's like sometimes it doesn't work out. So this year we're having to question how we're growing beets and how much we're going to dedicate, how much space and time we're going to dedicate to those, because I love growing them. Customers love them. Sometimes they're not as profitable as I want them to be. So yeah, I mean, that's important to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Question from Amalia is around starting no-till beds, new beds within a field with the perennial weeds in place. And I think she said that what they've done is mow quite tightly, then do a deep compost mulch using cardboard as a base, which is slow but effective. And wondered if you had any other suggestions for ways of doing that. We've got about a minute left.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing you could add to that is tarping it for a while to allow that, tarping it before you put the cardboard down. You can also tarp it afterward. You're going to encourage some moisture or some weeds maybe to come through. But for the most part, you will see a dramatic drop in your weed pressure. And any weeds you see, just go out there with a trowel, shovel, dig them up and deal with it. Because I had to do that this year with wild onions, and go and dig them up. And it's, if you dedicate the time now, like when you're starting your farm, to getting rid of those perennial weeds, they won't be an issue down the line. Yeah, and you just stay on it and keep your mulch up and make sure to keep your soil covered, and that helps tremendously with weeds.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we're almost out of time. We will have to finish at 5 on the dot, so people can head over to the closing plenary session. Thank you so much, Jesse. Just to say, people, if you want to continue the questions or discussion, I hope you don't mind me saying this, you can contact you via website, on the Instagram. We've put the links in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you to everyone that came, and I really appreciate all those questions. They were great. Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope everybody heads over to watch the closeout.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone, and happy end of conference.